The wind on that train platform wasn't just wind. It was a living thing, cold, sharp, and angry. It tore at the frayed edges of her shawl, trying to rip the last bits of warmth right off her back. She stood there, spine straight, boots too thin for the snow packed hard as iron beneath her feet. A single bag dangled from her wrist, canvas worn to threads. Her knuckles were white from gripping it. She didn't flinch when the station master gave her a look that said she was trash blown in on the storm. She didn't move when the whispers started from a group of townsfolk nearby. Is that her? Not what I expected. Lord, and he's so rich. Lily. That's what she was calling herself now. The name Grace Harper was buried back in Kansas, under a pile of lies and letters that still smelled like whiskey and fear. The train let out a final hissing breath and pulled away, leaving nothing but the cold and the murmurs. And then he appeared. A man walked out of the swirling snow, broad-shouldered in a worn duster, a dark hat pulled low. He moved with a quiet purpose, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the wooden planks. He wasn't carrying a welcome bouquet, he was carrying a folded letter, the one she'd answered 3 weeks ago with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. Colton Hayes, the man who had written, "I don't promise riches or romance, just a roof, a quiet life, and a place at the table." He stopped a few feet from her. His hazel eyes were calm, too calm. "You're Lily," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you're Colton." He gave a short, sharp nod. He gestured to a wagon waiting nearby. It was clean, sturdy, with strong horses already harnessed. No servant, no welcome party. Just him. "Let's go," he said. She expected him to hesitate, to look at her ragged clothes, the dirt on her hem, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. He didn't. He turned his back on her, trusting her to follow. So she did. The ride to the Hayes homestead was long and silent. They passed miles of empty land, pale grass frozen under a white sky. The mountains in the distance were like giant sleeping beasts capped in snow. Lily sat beside Colton on the wagon bench. The only sounds were the creak of the leather reins and the steady beat of the horse's hooves. She stole a glance at him. He was a man who had built walls around himself, not fences. There was a tightness in his jaw, a weariness in his eyes that was older than his years. She had to break the silence. The quiet was starting to feel heavy. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Mostly." "Why me?" she asked. "Why did you choose my letter?" He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You answered." That was it. No other explanation. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't comment on her appearance. He wasn't trying to rescue her. And somehow that was more unsettling than anything else. Because if he wasn't trying to rescue her, then what exactly did he want with her? The ranch came into view as the sun began to dip below the horizon. A tall archway carved with the name Hayes stood at the entrance. Beyond it, fences stretched out as far as the eye could see, wrapping around huge pastures, barns, and fields, sleeping under a thick blanket of frost. The main house was a 2-story monster of dark timber and stone. It didn't look modest. It looked like a fortress. "You said you had a small farm," she murmured, her voice catching in her throat. Colton didn't even glance at her. "I didn't say how small." He drove the wagon past a long bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and rows of hay bales taller than she was. 2 ranch hands tipped their hats as they passed, their eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. A woman in her 60s watched them from the kitchen porch. She had dark hair pulled into a tight braid and a face carved with the kind of lines that came from seeing too much. "That's Rosa," Colton said. "She runs the kitchen." "Do you trust her?" Lily asked. He gave a strange, humorless smile. "With my life." He brought the wagon to a stop and stepped down. He walked around and held out a hand to her. It wasn't a gentlemanly gesture to help a lady. It was a simple offer of balance, practical and nothing more. His hand was calloused and warm. The house smelled of cedar, coal smoke, and roasting meat. The floors gleamed. Everything was clean, organized and silent. The parlor was lined with books, but they looked like they had never been read. A violin sat on a shelf, gathering dust. The air was so quiet, it felt like no one had spoken above a whisper in years. This wasn't a home, it was a waiting room. He led her to a guest room on the second floor. It was simple, clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out over the endless, empty snow. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "Longer if you want. And if I don't? There's a train back east in the morning." She hesitated in the doorway, a question burning on her lips. "You didn't ask why I came." "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to." He met her eyes, and for a second, she saw something flicker in their depths. Something that wasn't just coldness. Most men don't know what it's like to be cornered. Then he turned and walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the crushing silence. She closed the door behind her, and only then did she let her knees tremble. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, the frayed canvas bag clutched to her chest. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, but her hands shook as she reached into the bag and pulled out a small folded packet of letters. Each one was sealed with the same ugly wax stamp. Each one reeked of cheap whiskey and smoke, and fear. Her eyes darted around the room. No cross on the wall, no family pictures, no mirror. Good. She crawled to the bed, found a loose floorboard near the wall, and slipped the packet of letters beneath it. She pressed the board down flat. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress, pulled off her worn-out boots, and whispered the name she had abandoned, the name that felt like a curse. Grace Harper. Just once, because tomorrow, Lily would have to wake up again, and Lily had to be strong. But as she lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, a new fear began to creep in. It was a cold, sharp fear that had nothing to do with the man she was running from. It had to do with the man sleeping downstairs, the man who built walls instead of fences, the man who knew what it was like to be cornered. What if she hadn't escaped a cage at all? What if she had just walked right into a bigger one? The fire in Colton's study had burned down to glowing embers. He leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He hadn't wanted it. He just poured it out of habit, a familiar weight to hold on to in the suffocating quiet of his own home. Upstairs he could hear her, faint footsteps pacing back and forth, back and forth. She wasn't afraid of the house. She was trying to figure out if it would keep her safe. He knew that feeling. He remembered it all too well. Years ago, another woman had walked these same halls. Vivian Ashford. She had a laugh like champagne bubbles and a heart like a shard of ice. She wore silk in the mornings and complained about the dust on furniture that had been in his family for generations. She'd wanted his name, his land, his money. She had never once asked about him. The end came swiftly. He'd overheard her on the porch one night, talking to her cousin. "You think I care about this dirt-caked rancher?" She'd laughed. "Colton's the richest man for 3 counties. He's dumb enough to think love has anything to do with it. Just watch me walk down that aisle." He hadn't confronted her. He hadn't yelled. He just walked back into the house, poured a drink, and the next morning, he told her to leave. He didn't even let her finish her tearful, lying excuses. After that, Colton Hayes had gone quiet. He built the ranch bigger, bought better stock, and let the whispers in town call him reclusive, cold, haunted. He didn't care, until the loneliness became a weight too heavy to carry. One night he'd written that letter, simple, honest. "I have a roof, a ranch, and quiet. If you're looking for diamonds, don't answer. If you're looking for a place at the table, write me back." A few women replied. Their letters were polished and greedy. Then came hers, Lily's. No photograph, just firm handwriting. "I cook well, sew better, and I don't ask questions I wouldn't want to answer myself. I'd like to see an open sky again." That last line had snagged something in his chest. And now she was here, pacing in the room above him, a ghost in his silent house. And he didn't know a damn thing about her. But there was one more thing he had to do. He walked to a heavy oak cabinet in the corner of the study. He unlocked it with a small iron key. Inside, it wasn't filled with whiskey or guns. It was filled with files. Dozens of them. Each file had a name, a woman's name, and a story of escape. He pulled out a new, empty file and wrote on the tab in neat block letters, Lily. Then he locked the cabinet. The sound of the key turning echoed the final, metallic click of a cage door swinging shut. The next morning, Lily was in the kitchen before the sun. She had her sleeves rolled up, one of Rosa's aprons tied around her waist, and she was chopping potatoes with a quiet, fierce precision. Rosa entered, a basket of fresh eggs on her arm, and stopped. She watched Lily for a long moment. "You don't have to do that, Mia," Rosa said, her voice softer than it had been the day before. Lily looked up, a little startled. "I didn't know what else to do with my hands." "You have good hands," Rosa said, her dark eyes sharp. "They know work." It was both a compliment and a warning. They worked in silence. By the time the biscuits were in the oven, a burly man with a thick beard stumbled in, yawning. It was Jed, the foreman she'd seen yesterday. He stopped dead when he saw her. "This her?" he grunted, jerking a thumb in her direction. Colton appeared in the doorway right behind him. "Yep." Jed scratched his beard, his eyes narrowing as he looked Lily up and down. "Don't look like much." Colton's voice was ice. "Didn't hire her to decorate the parlor, Jed." Lily didn't react. She didn't even flinch. She just kept her eyes on the skillet, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Jed looked at her with a flicker of something that might have been respect. Later that afternoon, Colton took her on a tour of the ranch. It was vast, organized, teeming with life. Every fence post, every barn, every tool hanging in its proper place spoke of relentless work. "You said you worked on a farm," he said. "I did. Never stayed long enough to call one mine." He nodded. "This one's mine. But Rosa runs the kitchen, Jed runs the crew, and the land mostly runs itself." They walked toward the east pasture. A young black colt was limping along the fence line, favoring its right foreleg. Colton frowned. "He's been off since the storm." Before he could say another word, Lily ducked under the fence rail. She approached the colt slowly, murmuring in a low, calm voice. The animal's ears twitched, but it didn't shy away. She reached out and ran a gentle hand down its leg, her fingers probing with expert care. "Stone bruise," she said after a moment. "He'll be fine in a week, just needs a poultice." Colton watched her, his expression unreadable. "You know horses." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "I know limping." A current passed between them. Not attraction, not yet. It was something more fundamental, a shared understanding of pain. But that night, as Lily lay in her bed, the memory of that moment was spoiled by a new, chilling discovery. While tidying the room, she'd decided to dust the bookshelf. Her fingers had brushed against the spine of a worn copy of Moby Dick. It felt loose. She pulled the book out. Tucked inside was a small, tin-type photograph. It showed a woman with laughing eyes and dark, curly hair. She was standing on the porch of this very house. On the back, a single word was written in faded ink. Disappeared. Lily's blood ran cold. Who was this woman? And what did Colton Hayes mean when he told her that most men don't know what it's like to be cornered? Was he the one doing the cornering? The frost had barely melted off the grass when Lily was back at work. She fed the chickens, mucked out the stalls, and moved with a purpose that was half genuine effort and half desperation. She was trying to build a wall of work and routine between herself and the gnawing fear that had taken root in her heart. The photograph was a secret she kept tucked away, a cold weight in her pocket. Disappeared. Jed, the foreman, had started calling her the quiet one. He even gave her a nod in the mornings now, instead of a grunt. Rosa had entrusted her with the sourdough starter, a living thing Rosa had kept alive for 17 years. Even the horses seemed to trust her. But the humans were a different story. Every quiet glance from Colton, Every watchful stare from Rosa felt like a judgment or a warning. 3 days later, the tension snapped. Colton returned from a trip into town with a nasty gash along his forearm. "A stray piece of wire from a broken fence," he said. Rosa clucked over him, scolding him all the way to the kitchen table. "I'm too old to see straight for this kind of work," Rosa declared, thrusting a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a jar of salve at Lily. "You do it." Colton sat at the table without protest, his jaw set, his sleeve rolled up to his elbow. Lily's hands trembled, but she forced them steady. She cleaned the wound with a slow, gentle touch. He didn't wince. He just watched her. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken things. "You're good at this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've patched up worse." "On yourself?" She hesitated for just a second too long. "Sometimes." He didn't push. Instead, his eyes dropped to her hands. Calloused, quick, clean. As she finished tying the bandage, he reached out with his good hand, not to touch her, but to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her face. The back of his knuckles grazed her cheek. Lily's breath hitched. It wasn't the gesture itself. It was the kindness, the unexpected, unearned kindness. It was a crack in the wall he had built around himself, and it confused her more than his coldness ever had. That night she couldn't sleep. The photograph felt like it was burning a hole in her mattress. She had to know. After the house was dark and silent, she crept downstairs. The study door was unlocked. The room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Her eyes went straight to the heavy oak cabinet in the corner. It was locked. Of course it was. Defeated, she turned to leave, but her eyes caught something on the desk. It was the file he had created for her. Lily. It was open, and beside it was another file. The name on the tab made her heart stop. It was the name of the woman from the photograph. Vivian. Her hands shaking, Lily opened the file. It wasn't a story of escape. It was a collection of letters, legal documents, and private investigator reports. Vivian Ashford hadn't just been a gold digger. She had been a con artist. She had a history of charming, wealthy, lonely men, and then blackmailing them. The reports detailed how she had tried to ruin Colton, spreading vicious rumors in town, attempting to turn his business partners against him. She hadn't disappeared. Colton had exposed her. He had quietly and systematically dismantled her scheme and sent her packing with nothing but the clothes on her back. Lily sank into the chair, relief and shame washing over her in equal measure. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been deeply wounded, a man who had learned to protect himself at all costs. His quietness wasn't menace. It was armor. But as she placed the file back on the desk, another, colder realization hit her. At the very back of Vivian's file was a recent report from the investigator. It was dated just 1 week ago. It said that Vivian Ashford had been seen in a town just 2 counties over. And she wasn't alone. She had been seen talking to a man in a long black coat who carried a silver-tipped cane. A man Lily knew all too well, Cassian Trent. Her past wasn't just catching up to her. It was collaborating with his. The letter arrived the next morning. It wasn't delivered by the postman. It was tucked into a feed sack in the barn, a place only a handful of people would go. Lily found it when she went to fetch oats for the colt with the bruised foot. She unfolded the cheap paper, her hands trembling so hard she could barely read the words. It wasn't a letter. It was a message, made from letters cut out of a newspaper and glued to the page. The house always wins. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. She folded the note, slid it deep into her apron pocket, and went about her morning chores as if nothing had happened. But her mind was a hornet's nest. Someone on this ranch had put it there. Someone knew who she was. Or worse, someone was working with Cassian. Was it Jed, with his suspicious glares? Or Rosa, whose kindness could be a mask? Or was it Colton himself, playing some kind of twisted game? That evening, The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on. Colton found her on the porch, staring out at the darkening sky. "There's a community supper at the church tonight," he said, his voice startling her. "It's good for the town to see us together." Her first instinct was to say no, to hide, but the words on the note burned in her pocket. Hiding was what Cassian wanted. "See us?" she asked, her voice tight. "Or see me?" "They're already watching," he said, his gaze steady. "Might as well show them something worth watching." "I don't have anything to wear." It was a weak excuse, but it was all she had. Just then, Rosa appeared in the doorway, a soft gray dress draped over her arm. "You do now," she said, her expression unreadable. "It was mine a long time ago. You'll fill it out better." The church hall was a sea of lamplight, noise, and judging eyes. As Lily walked in on Colton's arm, a hush fell over the room. Conversations didn't stop, but they lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. She saw him then. Jed. The foreman was standing near the back, talking to a few other ranchers. He saw them enter, and his eyes narrowed. He gave Colton a curt nod, but his gaze lingered on Lily with cold suspicion. He knew. He had to be the one who left the note. Then she saw her. Vivian Ashford. She was even more beautiful than her photograph, dripping with jewels and disdain. She stood with a small group of the town's most influential women, a glass of punch in her hand. Her laughter was loud and sharp. "Well, well," Vivian's voice carried across the room, clear as a bell. "Isn't that brave? Picking up another stray from the side of the road, Colton? You never learn." Lily's spine went rigid. Vivian sauntered over, her eyes raking over Lily's simple dress. "Let me give you some advice, little mouse. He has a habit of collecting broken things, but he gets bored easily. They always disappear." She said the last word with a cruel, knowing smile. Before Lily could find her voice, Colton stepped in front of her, shielding her. "Vivian," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you're not welcome on my land, and you're not welcome near her. Leave." Vivian's face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this, Colton, both of you!" She shot one last venomous glare at Lily before storming out of the hall. The encounter left Lily shaken. They sat at a long table, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her arm. She jumped. It was Rosa. The old woman leaned in close, her voice a fierce whisper. "That woman is a snake. But the snakes you can see are not the ones that bite you." Her eyes flicked towards Jed, who was still watching them from across the room. The message was clear. Just then, Colton leaned in from her other side. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low and urgent. He reached into his coat pocket. Lily braced herself. This was it. The confession. The truth. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. He set it on the table beside her plate. Inside was a ring. It was simple, elegant, white gold, etched with a delicate pattern that looked like stalks of wheat. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She wore it through drought and fever and loss. It represents strength, endurance." He looked her straight in the eye. "I know you're running from something, Lily. I don't need to know the details. I just need to know you'll stop running and stand with me." Her breath caught in her throat. Tears burned behind her eyes. This wasn't a trap. This was a lifeline. "Colton, You don't have to answer now," he said, his calloused hand gently covering hers. "Just think about it." Later that night, back at the ranch, Lily couldn't escape the whirlwind of her own thoughts. Colton's offer, Vivian's threat, Rosa's warning, Jed's stare, and the note. The house always wins. She needed air. She slipped out of the house and walked towards the barn, the cold air a welcome shock to her system. As she passed the bunkhouse, she heard voices, Jed's gruff baritone and another man's. She pressed herself into the shadows, listening. "Are you sure it's her?" the other man asked. "Positive," Jed growled. "Saw the poster myself in Cheyenne. Grace Harper, wanted for questioning in the disappearance of a very important ledger from a Mr. Cassian Trent in Kansas. There's a $1,000 reward. Lily's world tilted on its axis. So what are you gonna do? The other man asked. What do you think? Jed said. $1,000 is $1,000. I'll wait for the right moment, when the boss is gone. Then I'll tie her up and send a wire to Trent myself. Lily clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned and ran, not looking back, her feet flying across the frozen ground. She burst into the main house, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She raced up the stairs, past her own room, straight to Colton's. She didn't knock. She threw the door open. Colton! He was standing by the window, staring out into the night. He turned, his face a mask of stone. They know, she gasped, leaning against the doorframe. Jed knows who I am. He's going to turn me in. Colton didn't look surprised. He didn't look concerned. He just looked tired. He crossed the room and gently took her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, steadying. I know, Lily, he said, his voice impossibly calm. Her eyes widened in confusion. You know? I've known since before you arrived. He let go of her and walked over to the heavy oak cabinet in the corner. He unlocked it with the small iron key. What is this? She whispered, her fear turning into a disorienting fog. He didn't answer. He just opened the cabinet doors. It wasn't filled with files. It was an arsenal. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, and boxes of ammunition lined the shelves from top to bottom. Colton, what is all this? He turned to face her, and the mask finally fell away. In his eyes, she saw a fire she had never seen before. A dangerous, protective fire. Cassian Trent isn't just after you, Grace, he said, using her real name for the first time. He's after something you took. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a telegram. This arrived this morning, he said. Jed isn't working for Trent. He's working for me. The $1,000 reward isn't real, it's bait. We put the poster up ourselves. Grace stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. Bait? For who? For the real traitor, he said, his voice like flint. The one who left you that note in the barn. He looked past her towards the hallway. Isn't that right, Rosa? Grace spun around. The old housekeeper was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. But it wasn't fear in her eyes. It was pure, unadulterated hatred, and in her hand, she was holding a small, deadly-looking Derringer pistol aimed directly at Grace's heart. The lamplight in the hallway cast long, dancing shadows, making Rosa look like a specter of vengeance. The tiny pistol in her hand seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Rosa? Grace whispered, the name a puff of disbelief. Colton didn't move. He stood by the open gun cabinet, calm and ready, as if he'd been expecting this all along. Drop it, Rosa. The old woman's lips twisted into a snarl. Not until she tells me where it is. Where what is? Grace asked, her mind reeling. Don't play dumb with me, you little thief, Rosa shrieked, her voice cracking. My daughter, my sweet Maria. She was in Wichita. She worked in a boarding house, a respectable place, she said. Her eyes filled with tears of rage. She got mixed up with him, with Cassian Trent. She saw what he was. She tried to get away. She told me she had proof, something that could put him away forever, a little black book. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over Grace. She thought back to that frantic, terrifying night she ran. She had just grabbed her canvas bag, stuffing her few belongings into it in a blind panic. The last letter I got from her, Rosa sobbed. She said a new girl, a girl named Grace, was going to help her. But then, silence. The letters stopped. They told me she'd run off, but I knew. He did something to her. Rosa's gaze, burning with a grief so profound it was terrifying, locked onto Grace. And then you show up, the girl who was supposed to help her, the girl who survived. Where is my daughter, Grace? And where is the book? Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. Maria, a sweet girl with frightened eyes, who had whispered her plans in the dead of night. Grace had tried to help her, creating a diversion while Maria slipped out the back. She'd been caught and beaten and locked in the storeroom. She always assumed Maria had made it. "Rosa, I didn't know," Grace stammered. "I thought she got away." "Liar!" Rosa screamed, her finger tightening on the trigger. "It's the truth," Colton said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I had my investigators look into it. Maria was caught a mile outside of town. Trent's men brought her back." He paused, his voice softening. "I'm sorry, Rosa. She's gone." The housekeeper crumpled as if her strings had been cut. A raw, animal sound of grief escaped her lips. The pistol clattered to the floor. Grace rushed forward, not with fear, but with a surge of empathy so strong it stole her breath. She knelt and wrapped her arms around the sobbing woman. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, her own tears falling now. "I'm so sorry." After a long time, the sobs subsided. Jed appeared in the doorway, his face grim. He gently helped Rosa to her feet and led her away, murmuring comforting words in Spanish. Grace was left alone with Colton in the room full of shadows and guns. "The ledger," she said, her voice hollow. "Maria's little black book." She walked numbly to her room, Colton following behind her. She knelt, pried up the loose floorboard, and pulled out her worn canvas bag. Her fingers fumbled with the lining, a place she hadn't touched in months. She felt the hard, rectangular shape hidden within the fabric. With a final tug, she ripped the seam open. A small, black, leather-bound ledger fell onto the floor. She had been carrying the evidence that could destroy Cassian Trent all this time, and she never even knew it. Maria must have slipped it into her bag during the chaos, hoping Grace would get it to safety. Colton picked it up, his expression grim. "This is why he's coming. It's not about you, Grace. It's about this. This book contains every crime, every name, every bribe. It's the key to his entire empire." A sudden, frantic barking erupted from outside, followed by a sharp yelp that was cut off abruptly. Colton's head snapped up. "They're here!" He moved with lightning speed, grabbing a rifle from the cabinet and a box of shells. "Grace, get to the cellar. The door's under the rug in the parlor. Stay there no matter what you hear." "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She looked at the ledger in his hand, at the gun in her own. Maria's ghost stood between them. "I'm not hiding anymore." His eyes met hers, and in that moment, an unspoken pact was sealed. They were in this together.
Suddenly, the front door of the house splintered inwards, kicked open with a violent crash. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the snowy night, was not Cassian Trent. It was Vivian Ashford. Her face was twisted in a triumphant sneer, and behind her stood two of the ugliest, meanest-looking thugs Grace had ever seen. "Hello, Colton," Vivian purred, stepping into the house as if she owned it. "Surprised to see me?" She gestured at the thugs behind her. "Mr. Trent is a very reasonable man. He's willing to trade, the girl and the book, for the ranch." Her eyes glittered with greed. "I told you you'd regret crossing me." The wind howled through the broken doorway, and the real storm began. The house erupted into chaos. Vivian's thugs charged forward, but Colton was ready. He fired the rifle from his hip, the blast echoing like a cannon in the enclosed space. The first thug stumbled back with a cry, clutching a shoulder that was suddenly gushing blood. The second one lunged, but Jed appeared out of nowhere, swinging a heavy iron poker from the fireplace like a battle axe. It connected with the man's head with a sickening thud, and he dropped to the floor like a sack of rocks. "Get the book to the cellar!" Colton yelled at Grace over the ringing in his ears. Vivian shrieked in frustration and pulled a small silver pistol from her fur muff. She fired wildly, the bullet ricocheting off the stone hearth. Grace didn't run to the cellar. She ran towards the back of the house, clutching the ledger to her chest. Maria's face was burned into her mind. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. She burst into the kitchen just as the back door was kicked in. Another of Trent's men stood there, a cruel smile on his face. Before he could raise his gun, a cast-iron skillet swung down from above and crashed against his skull. He crumpled to the ground, revealing Rosa standing on a stool, her face set like granite, the skillet still in her hand. "No one comes into my kitchen uninvited," she said, her voice deadly calm. From outside, more shouts echoed through the night. Cassian had brought more than a few hired guns. He had brought a small army. "They're surrounding the house," Jed yelled from the parlor. "Fall back to the study," Colton commanded. "It's the most defensible room." Grace, Colton, Jed, and Rosa scrambled into the study, barricading the heavy oak door with a desk, just as bullets began to splinter the wood. The room had only one window, looking out over the back orchard. It was a temporary reprieve, a cornered position. They were trapped. "He'll burn the house down if he has to," Jed said, reloading his rifle. Colton looked at Grace. His face was grim. "He wants the ledger, Grace. It's the only thing that matters." "Then let's give it to him," she said, a desperate, wild idea forming in her mind. "What?" Colton stared at her as if she were insane. "Not the real one." She looked at the fire burning in the study's hearth. She pointed to a thick, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare on the shelf. "That one is about the same size." Understanding dawned in Colton's eyes. A risky, insane plan, but it was the only one they had. He grabbed the Shakespeare book and wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth. Then he looked at Jed. "Can you get to the horses?" Jed nodded. "There's an old storm cellar 50 yards from the barn. The tunnel comes up behind the stables. I can make it." "Go," Colton ordered. "Get to town. Bring back the sheriff. We'll hold them off as long as we can." Jed gave a curt nod, checked his pistol, and slipped out the window into the darkness. Now it was just the three of them, Grace, Colton, and Rosa, surrounded and outgunned. Colton unbarred the door. "Trent!" he yelled into the chaotic darkness of the house. "You want the book? You can have it. A trade. The book for our lives." A cruel laugh echoed from the parlor. It was Cassian Trent. He had finally made his entrance. "The book first, Hayes!" Trent shouted back. "Throw it out! Then we'll talk about letting you live." Colton looked at Grace. She nodded. He threw the decoy book, wrapped in oilcloth, out of the study and into the main hall. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a triumphant shout from one of Trent's men. "We got it, boss!" The shooting stopped. Slowly, Cassian Trent stepped into view, his silver-tipped cane clicking on the floorboards. Vivian was right behind him, a smug, victorious look on her face. "You see, my dear Grace," Cassian said, a cold smile playing on his lips. "I told you, the house always wins." He picked up the wrapped book. "Now about our deal." He began to unwrap the oilcloth. Colton raised his rifle. Rosa held her skillet like a weapon. Grace held her breath. Cassian pulled the book free. He stared at the gold-leaf title on the spine. The complete works of William Shakespeare. His face, for a split second, was a mask of confusion. Then that confusion contorted into a snarl of pure, murderous rage. "Tricked me!" he roared, his voice inhuman. He threw the book aside and raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Colton. But before he could fire, a new sound cut through the night. The thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them, and a voice bellowing from the darkness outside. "This is Sheriff Miller! Throw down your weapons! You are surrounded!" Jed had made it. Cassian froze, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. Vivian screamed, but the twists weren't over. Because the voice that shouted wasn't coming from the front of the house. It was coming from the back, from the orchard. And another voice joined it, a woman's voice, strong and clear. "Cassian Trent, you are under arrest for the murder of Maria Sanchez." Rosa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stumbled towards the study window and looked out. A small army of armed riders was emerging from the trees. At their head was Jed and the sheriff. But the woman who had shouted, Rosa recognized her. She was part of a network Rosa belonged to, a secret society of women who helped others escape men like Trent. Rosa's frantic messages for help, sent via a hidden telegraph wire, had reached them after all. They had brought their own justice. It was a pincer movement, the law at the front and avenging angels at the back. Cassian was trapped, utterly and completely. He looked from the window to the door, his eyes like a cornered rat. He grabbed Vivian, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. "Don't shoot!" he screamed. But Vivian wasn't a victim. She drove her elbow back into his gut, hard. He grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She broke free and made a run for it, scrambling towards the broken front door. She never made it. A single shot rang out from the top of the stairs. Vivian crumpled to the floor, a neat black hole in her back. Everyone froze. Standing at the top of the staircase, smoke curling from the barrel of a pistol, was the station master, the same man who had given Grace such a contemptuous look when she first arrived. "No loose ends," he said, his voice flat and cold, before turning the pistol on himself. He had been on Trent's payroll the whole time. In that moment of stunned silence, Cassian saw his chance. He bolted, not for the door, but towards Grace. He was going to take her down with him. He was fast, but Colton was faster. Colton didn't shoot. He tackled Cassian, and the two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The real ledger skittered across the floor from where Grace had dropped it. Cassian's hand shot out, his fingers closing around the small black book. He had it. A wild, triumphant grin spread across his face. Even surrounded with this, he could bargain his way out. He could still win. He scrambled to his feet, holding the book aloft like a trophy. "It's over, Sheriff!" he crowed. "I have what I came for!" He didn't see Grace scoop up the heavy iron poker Jed had dropped. She swung it with all the force of her fear, her grief, and her rage. The poker connected with Cassian's wrist with a sickening crack. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and the ledger flew from his nerveless fingers. It landed at the feet of Sheriff Miller, who had just stepped through the front door. The sheriff bent down, picked it up, and tucked it safely into his coat. The house hadn't won. She had. The first real snow fell 2 weeks later. It came down soft and silent, a thick white blanket that covered the scars on the land and the memory of violence. It was a cleansing. The Hayes Ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence Grace had first encountered. It was a peaceful quiet, full of unspoken strength and the promise of a new beginning. Cassian Trent was gone. The ledger, Maria's legacy, had been his undoing. It was a key that unlocked a dozen secret doors, revealing a web of corruption that stretched across 3 territories. The station master, Vivian, they were just the tip of the iceberg. With that little black book, the law wasn't just able to jail a man. They were able to dismantle an empire of cruelty. Grace Harper stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes drift down. The name no longer felt like a curse. It felt like her own. Behind her, Rosa was humming as she kneaded bread. The housekeeper's grief was still there, a shadow in her eyes, but it was no longer the all-consuming fire it had once been. They had found Maria's grave, and now, finally, she could begin to mourn. Colton came in from the barn, brushing snow from his shoulders.
He walked up behind Grace and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Snow's coming in heavy," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Might trap us here for a few days." She leaned back against him, a real smile touching her lips. "Sounds peaceful." Later that day, she sat by the fire in the parlor, a needle and thread in her hands. She was mending the lining of her old canvas bag, the one that had carried so much more than just her belongings. As she stitched the worn fabric, she felt as if she were stitching the torn pieces of her own life back together. Jed came in, tracking snow across the clean floor. He didn't look gruff anymore. He looked at Grace, and his eyes were full of a deep, quiet respect. "Sheriff sent word," he said. "They won't be needing you to testify. With that ledger, they got enough on Trent to see him hang 10 times over." He paused. "And that network of Rosa's, they found a dozen other women he hurt. They're all talking now. You gave them a voice, Grace. She looked down at the needle in her hand, a single tear splashing onto the canvas. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. As the evening drew in, casting a warm, golden glow over the snow-covered world outside, Colton sat down beside her. He didn't say a word. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch. He opened it and held it out. Inside, the white gold ring, etched with stalks of wheat, seemed to shine with its own inner light, a symbol of strength, endurance, a new harvest. Grace looked from the ring to his face. His hazel eyes were full of a question he didn't need to ask. She took the ring from the box, and with a hand that was perfectly steady, slid it onto her own finger. It was a perfect fit. The house wasn't a fortress anymore. It wasn't a waiting room or a sanctuary for broken things. It was a home. And Grace Harper, who had arrived with nothing but a fake name and a bag full of secrets, now stood in the warm light of the fire, whole and healed. She wasn't Lily the stray, or Grace the victim. She was Grace, the survivor, the woman who had faced down the storm and found her own open sky. She had been running from a man who believed the house always wins. But she had learned a more powerful truth. A home isn't 4 walls and a roof. It's the people you're willing to fight for. And that was a house that could never be defeated. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next wave of suspense.